A terrifying shriek caused me to bolt upright and nearly fall out of bed. I frantically searched about, trying to understand what was happening, but I couldn't see in the darkness. Another scream startled me, one which I immediately recognized as V's. She was writhing under the sheets and gasping for breath. Damn it. It had been months since I'd woken up to one of her night terrors. Even longer than that, it seemed. There was never a good way to prepare for them. V! I shouted as I tried to shake her awake. V! A burst of rapid, breathless screams suddenly sprang from V's mouth as she jerked away from my touch and bumped against the wall. Where am I? V screamed. V, it's me. It's Judy. You're in bed. Do you hear me? It was just a nightmare. I knew better than to touch her right now, especially in the dark, as I was liable to end up with a fist to the jaw. Judy? V was breathing in ragged gasps that were steadily slowing. I'm gonna hold you, okay? Oh, okay. I quickly reached over and felt for her in the dark. Once I found V's shoulders, I quickly wrapped my arms around her and pulled her tightly against me. Her arms trembled as she gripped me as tightly as she could. Shh. You're safe, V. You're safe. I continued the familiar litany as I laid down, pulling V with me. It had been a bad one. Probably one of the worst I'd ever seen her have. It had been a terrifying experience the first time I'd woken up to the sound of V screaming. I'd been rummaging for something in the spare room when the shrieking started. I panicked and grabbed a box cutter. It was the only thing I could find, to fight off whoever had broken into our apartment. But I stopped in my tracks when I saw V alone on the couch, pounding her fists against the upholstery. Once V had calmed down, she explained that her nightmares were horrible reenactments of gigs, and they always ended with her being killed. Her brain was creative with the methods. Stabbed, shot, beaten. Though, most of all, she usually found herself being strangled. I shivered when she told me they didn't end when her windpipe was crushed. Instead, they carried on. V had explained they were just night terrors, and she'd experienced them for years, even acknowledging there was some underlying trauma manifesting itself through them. It was understandable, considering the things she did to earn a living often involved violence. But as the nightmares continued, I noticed troubling signs that there was more than just traumatic stress at work. Even when she would thrash about wildly, V's arms would remain pinned at their sides by some invisible assailant, and her screams often came out strangely muffled.
Get it off my face.
I shook the memory from my head. V had gotten a much better handle on things over the last year, and this most recent episode had been the first one in months. She was okay. Her breathing had finally steadied, and her muscles had stilled. I ran a hand through her hair. You okay? I whispered. Yeah. Sorry. Nothing to be sorry about, V. You want to talk about it? V said nothing. Instead, she shook her head against my chest. Before long, she had drifted back to sleep. I tried to join her, but it soon became apparent I wouldn't have any such luck. A dull ache radiated from my skull, and I was relieved when I glanced at the door and saw a faint glimmer of light outside. I carefully nestled out of V's grip and tiptoed into the kitchen so I could start brewing a pot of coffee. The first cup went down quickly, as did the second. But I slowed down with the third as the throbbing in my head subsided, and by the time I was finishing my fourth, V finally poked her head out. You leave any for me? Mm-hmm. V shuffled into the kitchen and poured herself a cup before plopping down onto the floor in front of me and crossing her legs. Been a while since you had one of those, I observed. V nodded. Yeah, I guess that's why it was so bad. Thanks for calming me down. Mm-hmm. We were both quiet as we sipped at our coffee. Did you have fun last night? Yep. I hated playing these kinds of games. We both knew what needed to be discussed, and yet it was like we were both stuck playing out a scene from a bad play. Hopefully, we were reaching the end of the banter and could get into the meat of things. V shifted uneasily. Can we talk? I straightened up, finally. Sure. V set her cup down and drew a deep breath. I thought a lot about yesterday. What you said, what I said. I know I told you last night, but I need to say it again now that you're really awake. I'm really fucking sorry, Judy. I don't know what the fuck is wrong with me. I feel like I'm turning into a fucking monster. The small stab of guilt I'd felt last night at ignoring her was nothing compared to the avalanche of it tumbling over me now. I'd been on the other side of the fence before, feeling like shit for something I'd said or done and knew it was a horrible feeling, and I'd intentionally kept her there, like a sadist. I leaned forward and set my cup on the table before kneeling next to V and taking her hands into my own. They were cold as ice. "You're not a monster, V. It's okay." "No, it's not. I feel like shit." My throat tightened. I didn't want her suffering like this anymore. I embraced V. It wasn't the casual sort of hug we exchanged on the way in and out like some old married couple, but a true embrace, one in which I tried to squeeze as much love into as possible while kicking myself for wondering if I was doing it for her benefit or my own. "I believe in you, Judy." Shit. My lip began trembling, and I knew she could feel it against her shoulder. A tear spilled from my eye when she tightened her grip around me, and all the while, my guilt kept growing. She couldn't know, just how cold and calculating I was. Drawing a shaky breath, I pulled away and wiped my eyes, noticing that hers were shimmering as well. She opened her mouth, but I raised my hand in the air, stopping her. I couldn't stand for V to apologize to me anymore. "I know you believe in me, V. I know that. Sometimes we just go off the deep and say shit we don't mean. No more about it, alright?" V nodded eagerly. "Good. So, what do you say we give this one more shot and try to get it right?" "Sounds preem," V chuckled, wiping the wetness from her eyes. Do you mind if I start?" I blinked, surprised by V's sudden initiative. Sure. "Nova. So, help me understand something. Why do you want to do this? I think that's where I've been getting hung up." Now I realized my earlier mistake. I'd been so hell-bent on explaining what I wanted to do, I'd never explained why. It seemed simple enough. Hell, how would I react if V came home one day and announced she wanted to open a fish farm? Suppose I should have started there, huh? I looked out the window towards Night City. "You're right, V. I hate this fucking place. Every building, every street, even this roach motel we're living in. This ain't about the dolls or trying to get back at the claws or any of that shit. I want to get out. But if I leave now, I'm gonna end up walking away knowing this city got the best of me. We fucked up with Clouds before, and I gotta make that right. I have to, V." There was something oddly uncomfortable about exposing myself like this, like I wasn't supposed to be this open. "I get it now," V said. "You do?" "Yeah, I mean, who doesn't want to take a shit all over this city and rub its face in it on the way out of town?" "Now there's an image," I chuckled. "I think I was afraid you were, I don't know, disappointed in me or something. Like you thought you had to fix all the shit I've broken and drag us out of here by yourself. Not at all, V. I couldn't do the things you do. I just don't want you doing them anymore. I don't want you waking up like this or falling asleep on the couch every night trying to stay up for me. I don't want..." My voice gave out. I was on the verge of tears all over again. V's hand found its way onto my cheek. Her touch was warm now. "Tell me." It was perhaps my greatest fear, something I had buried in the darkest recesses of my mind. We'd talked about it when we first met, but lately the topic had been swept under the rug. I'm scared of the day I get a call saying they found you laying in some alleyway. You know it's gonna happen, V. It's just the law of probability. Maybe you'll get stabbed and bleed out, or maybe it'll be a bullet and you won't even see it coming, but it's gonna happen to you if we don't get out of here. And this is the fastest way I can see it doing that. It was V's turn to embrace me. Her grip was firm, and I realized I might have just hit her with another ticket for a guilt trip, though at least this time it wasn't intentional. "I told you I believe in you," V whispered. "You heard that, right?" "Yeah. And you're sure you want to take this on, starting a biz, I mean?" "I do." My voice barely creaked from my throat. V pulled away to reveal a striking intensity in her gaze. "Then what the fuck are you doing on the floor, Alvarez?" V smiled. "You got a business to start." My breath hitched. Had she just agreed to it? I was confident I'd heard her clearly, but still, I needed to hear it again just to be sure. Really? V nodded, her smile growing as my face lit up. What about the Eddies? I know you'll get them back. Like I said, I believe in you. I couldn't contain myself anymore. A torrent of joy burst free inside of me as I leapt forward and knocked V to the ground. I'd screwed things up so badly with my words that I thanked her the only way I knew I wouldn't mess up, by smashing my lips against hers. Yeah, you're welcome, V breathed as I worked my way towards her neck along the soft spot just behind her ear. V tilted her head back and moaned as I dragged my tongue along her skin and whispered into her ear. I'm gonna fuck the shit out of you, right here on the floor. V gasped. Her eyes were nearly lidded shut and her mouth hung open, almost amusingly so. I didn't need any further invitation and tore myself away from her just long enough to pull my shirt over my head. My nipples had already hardened into firm points, and I wanted to hang them over V's mouth so she could tease them. It would be easy to take all the pleasure I wanted from her, and I knew she would get off on it, but I restrained myself. She needed to know how grateful I was. V tried to sit up, but I pushed her firmly back to the floor with the flat of my palm. When I was certain she wasn't going to move, I stood and planted my legs on either side of her hips. Judy. I slid out of my panties, which were quickly becoming damp, and drank in this side before me. V had been completely undone, and I hadn't even started in on her yet. Her chest was heaving, causing the outlines of her plainly visible nipples to strain against her shirt. My eyes drifted lower, and I bit my lip when I saw the wet spots soaking through her panties. I had done that. And the hunger in her eyes? Fuck. All I wanted to do was drop to my knees and grind my pussy against her mouth for hours. She might put up a little fuss, perhaps even feign a brief struggle, but it would all be an act. V would love every second of it, and we both knew it. But I took a step back instead and dropped to my knees. I nudged her thighs apart and tried to decide where to start as if she were a buffet. V was panting as I shifted forward and straddled her hips. Her shirt was a plain V-cut with a single undone button at the top. It had to go. I grabbed the fabric with both hands and jerked apart as hard as I could. She gasped as the shirt gave way down the middle, exposing her breasts. I held onto the torn garment and wrenched it over her shoulders, pinning V's arms to the floor. I leaned forward to admire the firm cups of flesh just inches from my mouth. V was whimpering. I loved when she did that, her eyes begging me to fuck her, and the more worked up she became, the harder it was to resist and give in to her. I wrapped my lips around one of her breasts. V let out a vulgar moan that would have convinced me she was the best doll in all of Night City if I hadn't known better as my tongue flicked and teased the nub in my mouth. I smiled to myself when I felt her struggling to reach up and meeting the resistance of the tattered remains of her shirt I still clung to, keeping her arms fastened to the floor. I could tease her like this for hours. Fuck, Judy! I lifted my mouth, a thin trail of saliva still hanging from my lips. Later, I purred. I'm gonna fuck you first. I moved to her other breast, the one I knew was more sensitive. V bucked her hips, her moans growing louder as I danced my tongue around the delicate nub. It was so easy to get her worked up. But I stayed put and slowed my motions instead, torturing her by pulling my tongue back so that I was just grazing across the very tip of her nipple. V arched her back and tried to push more of herself into my mouth, but her movements were easy to predict. This always drove her wild, and I raised my head as she moved, keeping my mouth tantalizingly out of reach while continuing the same slow flicks. V growled in frustration as her arms strained against the restraints I held. But I enjoyed the ruse she was putting on just as much as she did. Her line of work required strength, and we both knew V could easily break free from my grip and take what she wanted if she truly wanted to. Finally, I pulled my mouth away and looked at her. I'm gonna let go of you. Don't you dare fucking move those arms, or I'll stop and leave you here on the floor like this. V nodded, and I could see the veins in her neck threatening to burst. I let go of the tattered remains of her shirt and slid further down V's body. my chin grazing just below her navel, which caused V to raise her knees and roll her hips back. I kept going until I had a perfect view of the thin, wet piece of fabric separating me from her pussy. Fuck. She smelled so good, and I could feel the heat radiating off of her. I dragged my tongue along the fabric in one smooth, long motion from bottom to top. Fuck, V whined, her nails scratching against the floor. I slid my fingers under the thin bands around her waist and pulled her panties down beneath her ass. V needed no instruction as she raised her knees to her chest, allowing me to slide them up and over her legs before throwing them aside. As she began lowering her legs back to the floor, I latched on to the inside of her thighs and pressed them back, forcing her knees against her breasts. Even though I was the one who was in control, I was only hanging on by a thread. The mere sight of V completely exposed with that perfect trimmed pussy of hers, just aching to be fucked, was almost too much. In fact, it was too much. I'd pushed V to the limit, and I'd barely even started yet. Lowering my face, I repeated my earlier motion, allowing my tongue to trace along her folds. V groaned in approval as I worked my way back down, setting a slow rhythm just the way she liked. I'd occasionally reach up to toy with her nipples, taking delight in the wanton sounds escaping her lips as I steadily picked up my pace. When she began bucking her hips, I dragged my tongue higher and finally lapped at her engorged clit. V cried out and grabbed a handful of my hair, holding me in place as she ground against my face. I considered stopping to punish her for not keeping her arms still, but I was already so aroused I didn't give a fuck anymore. I pushed a pair of fingers inside of her entrance, marveling at how easily they slid in, before curling my knuckles and slowly thrusting in and out of her, timing my motions with faster flicks of my tongue. V's moans echoed off of the walls as her thighs quivered and clamped tightly against my cheeks, keeping my head in place. I tweaked her sensitive nipple with my free hand and grinned as I felt her walls clench around my fingers. I winced as V tightened her grip on my hair, twisting painfully as her muscles tensed and her breath choked in her throat. But I kept going until V suddenly arched her back and a loud cry erupted from her lips. We stayed that way for what seemed like hours, locked in place as I slowly guided V down from her orgasm. Cool air rushed against my cheeks when V's thighs collapsed to the floor and went limp. I pulled away and looked up at her. I knew how I looked. My chin coated in her slick and the tangled mess she'd made of my hair, but it was nothing compared to the wreck she'd become. My pussy throbbed as V's eyes finally opened and met my gaze. I grinned and licked my lips with a devilish glint in my eye. My turn. V was utterly helpless in this disheveled state. That was exactly why I almost always made sure she got off first, or that we at least tried to climax together. But I wouldn't need much to get me off, just that remarkably talented tongue of hers.
And her eddies.
I flinched at the thought. Why the hell couldn't I get that out of my fucking mind? What did money have to do with this? Tightening my jaw, I shifted up and straddled her waist once more, shuffling my way forward until I was hovering just inches above V's mouth. Mine for the taking. She looked up at me with wide eyes and I suddenly realized V had gotten it all wrong. She wasn't the monster. I was. V blinked. She knew something was going on in my head, and if I didn't hurry, she'd ask what it was, and then I would have to lie. I spread my legs wider and lowered myself onto V's mouth. There was a muffled moan beneath me as I grabbed hold of V's hair and began riding her face. She took a firm grip of my ass and began vigorously lapping away at me. Christ, she was a poet with her tongue. Any lingering doubts dissolved away as V wrapped her arms over my legs, pulling me further into her mouth as she focused on my clit, lashing it over and over again, causing me to fall forward, my hands slapping hard onto the floor. I'd gotten myself so worked up torturing V, I knew I wouldn't last much longer. I stopped grinding against her face and allowed V to control the pace. She was grabbing onto my ass like her life depended upon it, and when a finger brushed against my asshole, it nearly threw me over the edge. I gasped in surprise before pushing back against the digit, gently circling the sensitive entrance just the way I liked. A smile crossed my lips. V was full of surprises, it seemed, even the dirty kind. It was sensory overload. The wet smacking of her tongue between my legs, the smell of our sex hanging heavy in the air, the taste of her own juices still fresh on my tongue. It drove me into a frenzied state. Not thinking or caring about anything else, I began fucking V's face once again, ignoring her muffled whimpers as I approached my climax. When I came, it was hard and violent. I screamed, not caring if the neighbors heard me. After all, they certainly would have heard V earlier. She worked me furiously with her tongue and inched the tip of her finger inside of my ass. I quivered and breathed in a ragged gasp as wave after wave of pleasure rippled between my legs. Eventually, V slowed and came to a stop. A gentle tap against my ass signaled it was time for her to breathe again. I raised my leg and flopped onto my side, still heaving for breath. V rolled over and threw an arm over me. "Thanks," she said, wiping some of my slick off of her face and licking her fingers clean. "Huh. Thank you," I chortled. We lay there on the dirty floor of our apartment, both drunk on the fading euphoria. Moments like these had been too few for us not to savor, too fleeting. Eventually, the time for us to return to reality came. With a groan, V rose to her feet and shuffled towards the bathroom. I needed to clean up too. There were smears on the floor. Whether it was hers or mine was a mystery. That would need to be wiped up. I considered joining V, the prospect of bathing each other under the hot drizzle of the shower to be remarkably enticing. But instead, I rose to my feet and grabbed my hollow off of the table. I scrolled through the studio listings until the building I'd looked at the night before stared back at me. With the press of a finger, I made the call. It rang several times before a man's face appeared. He was bald, with a thick line of stubble around his pudgy jaw, and was almost certainly overweight judging from the way his neck seemed to grow around his chin. "Cypher Dodgson here. What do you want?" I glanced at the bathroom door. V had given me the go-ahead, so why was I hesitating? The man cleared his throat, clearly annoyed. I turned my attention back to the screen. I'd taken care of V, and she'd taken care of me. "My name's Judy Álvarez. Looks like I'm going to be your new tenant." Everything became real in that instant, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like a sense of purpose within me that had been sorely absent. If only I'd known then what I know now.